Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Well, good middle of the day, actually. My name is Michaela Kalowski, and it's such a delight to be with you this year for the Bad Crime Writing Festival. In a moment, I'm going to introduce you to our guests. But I also wanted to say that we're also welcoming people who are joining us on Zoom as well as in the room, including those who are, watching across New South Wales in their local libraries, which we love. I would like to firstly acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, the land on which we meet today, and to pay respect on behalf of the Bad Crime Writing Festival to elders past, present and emerging. A couple of quick housekeeping things. If you've got a phone, just make sure it's on mute. That would be lovely. Please don't record the session. I think we're doing that for you. And if you do want to take a photo, just make sure your flash is off. However, saying that, if you do share on social media, we would love you to either tag us on Facebook or Instagram at Bad Crime Sydney, or you can use the hashtag Bad Crime Sydney on Twitter or X. Our authors will be signing books at the end of the session today, so you can hop out there and buy many, many copies for Christmas. You can get in early and have a chat with them as well. And I also should say, if you've been to another session this morning, this year we're doing a different thing. We're not having a Q&A at the end of our session. The feedback from wonderful people who'd been part of the festival was that they wanted more time to hear from the authors. I'm seeing a lot of nodding, which is great. But you will have time to speak to the authors in the signing line or after the signing line, so don't worry that you won't get time to share your reflections with them. I want to tell you a little bit about our guests before we dive in. I'm going to start with Michael Duffy, who's on the far end there. Michael is an Australian writer who's been a journalist, a broadcaster, an editor and a publisher. He's written both crime novels and true crime books, including Crime Histories of Sydney, Sydney Noir, The Golden Years and World War Noir with Nick Horden. His latest novels are all set in the Blue Mountains, The Man in Black, The Problem with Murder and The Strange Death of Paul Rule. They're set in the Blue Mountains and they're also only available in Blue Mountains bookstores, which we'll talk about as well. And he actually co-founded the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival and was chair of the board until 2021. Natalie Conyer, Nat, is in the middle. She was born and grew up in Cape Town, but has lived in Sydney for many years. She's such a crime fiction devotee that she actually did her doctorate on it. Her debut novel was called Present Tense, and it won the 2020 Ned Kelly Award for Best Debut Crime Fiction. It was shortlisted for the David Awards in both debut and general sections, and was voted one of the books of the year by The Australian. Its sequel, Shadow City, which we'll be talking about today, was published on the 3rd of September by Echo, Allen and Unwin. Her short stories have won many prizes in the annual Sisters in Crime Scarlet Stiletto competition, and they've featured in anthologies, and a collection of her short stories will also be published later this year. Last but not least, Alan Carter. Alan was born in the UK in Sunderland. He came to Australia in 1991 and now lives in the splendid semi-rural, semi-isolation south of Hobart in Tasmania. His latest book is called Prize Catch. It is set in Tasmania, and that's one we'll be talking about. He's also the author of the Fremantle set DC Cato Kwong series Prime Cut, which was winner of the Ned Kelly Award for Best First Fiction, Getting Warmer, Bad Seed, Heaven Sent and Crocodile Tears, and also the New Zealand set Marlborough Man and Doom Creek featuring Sergeant Nick Chester, which won the Nagai Marsh Award for Best Crime Novel. Today what I'm going to do is ask each of the authors to share their thoughts on the ways that crime is connected to place, and the relationship between landscape, history, culture and crime. And we'll also get a chance to hear about how they create the worlds they do and how they bring these wonderful stories and characters to life. But for now, please join me in making them all very welcome. So because we have two works that are very new, Alan's and Nat's, I thought what I wanted to do first is ask each author just to quickly take us into the world of the book. What's going on? Who do we meet? What's happening? If you want to give spoilers, you can, but you don't have to. Nat, I might start with you.
Okay, this is on? Yep. Yes. So Shadow City is set both in Sydney, mainly in Sydney, but also in Cape Town. And it's the second book in the Skulk Lawrence series, in which Skulk, who is a cop from South Africa, comes to Sydney. He's been asked to help find a missing girl. Meanwhile, another cop, Jackie Rose, a Sydney detective, is investigating the death of a young girl found in a food court in Chinatown. And I don't want to give any spoilers, but Skulk and Jackie join up and find an international link across Cape Town, South Africa, and the book then switches between the two places. I'm desperately trying to tell you things without telling you things. and they uncover, as happens in crime fiction, a much larger conspiracy and face great danger.
Very good. That was a very good, succinct one. Michael, can I get you to go next? The one I read was The Problem with Murder.
Thanks, Michaela. So The Problem with Murder is my first one, and I'd written some crime novels set in Sydney and then moved to the Blue Mountains about 10 years ago and thought that it would be a good way for me to learn more about the community and interact with the community, selling them in the bookshops there. So I based my detective, and there's two characters, a detective and the editor of the local newspaper, on a real cop called Gary Jublin that I'd actually written a book about before. He was the cop who did the William Tyrrell matter and disgraced himself and ended up leaving the police force for making illegal phone records of chats with witnesses. And I thought, what would have happened if he hadn't resigned? Because he did. Because his bosses didn't like him much, partly because he got more media than they did, and they were very jealous of him. And I thought maybe they would exile him to a place where they hoped he'd be so bored that he'd resign himself. So I sent my fictional character off to Katoomba. And then because he's a very sort of alpha male without a great amount of self-awareness, which can get a little bit boring after a while, I'd created this other character who's the editor of the local newspaper who can sort of look at him. They work together, but she can kind of be a bit wryly reflective on some of his weaknesses. So they're my two characters, and obviously in the end he does discover a lot of crime in Katoomba and he's not bored at all.
Thank God for crime, really. Alan, can we come to you? Tell us about the world of Prize Catch. Where are we? Who do we meet? What's going on?
The Prize Catch is set in the Dontracastor Channel, south of Hobart, which is kind of where I live. And it's my first book set in Tasmania. It's taken me 3 or 4 years to get up the nerve to write about Tasmania, because they all know where I live. It's an interesting two branches to it, and both of them were inspired by non-fiction books. There was Richard Flanagan's Toxic about the salmon industry in Tasmania, which some of you might have read, and Mark Willis's Rogue Forces about war crimes in Afghanistan. So both very different subjects, but both had that something about them that I thought would somehow make a crime novel, a good crime novel. So I attempted to do that and draw the two threads together. So you have basically an ex-military veteran who is suffering from PTSD and had not managed to hold down a job for yonks, but manages to land a job in the local salmon farm. So that's one thread of it. There's a cop, Jill Wilkie, who is on the verge of retirement, has been given a desk by the window and is pretty much ignored by her colleagues. And she wants to make one last statement before she quits. And there's Ros Chen, who, along with her partner, Neve, has recently moved to Tasmania from WA. She's a high-powered lawyer, but she's also suffering a kind of PTSD because she has been driven out of her job by toxic masculinity and bullying. So she's kind of a complete mess. And it's her partner, Neve, who has been holding it together. But Neve dies on page 2.
That's not a spoiler. Yeah. So there you can see they're 3 really wonderful books, and they're really different, and it was a great treat to read them together, thinking about place. I wanted to ask you, or each, to reflect on kind of that really general question about place in crime fiction, about how important it is. Because, later on I want to talk about gender and masculinity and how all the characters in your books are treated. I want to talk about, culture and landscape, and I want to ask you about, how you bring these characters to life, how you make them engaging. But we all know that crime is a huge component, place is a huge component where you set a crime novel. And Michael, I thought I might ask you to start with your reflections about why place is so sort of integral to crime fiction generally, as well as to the books you write.
Yeah, well, I suppose that with crime novels, there's a minimum amount of the real world you have to put in there, whereby if you're writing a literary novel, you can basically put in anything you like. and hope it works, but you don't actually have to say a lot about the external world. But I think in crime fiction, especially if it involves some sort of police investigation, you have to involve the real world, and you have to involve the details of people's lives in an often fairly prosaic way, of where they were at certain times, what their job is and so on. So I think it'd be very hard to write crime fiction without a sense of place to a much greater degree than in other types of fiction. And can I just say a word about Katoomba, or why I think that's a good place? So, I mean, there's two interesting things I think about regional crime. The first one is that they're not the city, and that's kind of, they all have that in common. And the great difference, I think, because I've written crime novels set in Sydney compared to setting one in the Blue Mountains, is that in a small community, you get to meet a much wider range of types of people, I think, than most of us do in the city. In the city, there's a sort of sorting that tends to go on, where we live, where we work, the people we mix with. There are so many options. People tend to sort of revert to their own kind to some extent, whereby in a country town, especially if you're someone like a cop or a journalist, you really have to deal with a much wider range of people, I think. And so in some ways, it's a very different experience to working in the city. And then, of course, the other thing about Katoomba is its unique aspects, which is that it's close to Sydney and it's got this extraordinary combination of people there, people coming up from the city and going back, people who are there for the million hectares of wilderness, people who are there for the flowers. So, there's always something going on, including a lot of crime.
Nat, can I ask for your thoughts on this as well? I mean, on the phone before today's session, we talked about, the Donna Leon books, these different series that have brought certain parts of the world to life. And also I want to ask you as well, the same way Michael did, why you chose to set part of your story in Cape Town and Sydney, but Cape Town in particular.
Okay, so first of all, place in general. I mean, crime fiction is it's a social genre. It's about laws, so you've got to have, it's public. You've got to have more than one person. And when you do, setting and place becomes incredibly important. And the crime novels that I love have a really strong idea of where they are and when they are. And Donna Leon, for example, Venice is as much a character in those books as the people are. And, it can, if you get it wrong, it becomes kind of crime tourism. But when it's done well, it's fantastic. My first book, Present Tense, was set in Cape Town, and I didn't know what I was doing, really. I grew up in Cape Town and hadn't been back for decades, and then went back, and of course, apartheid had ended a long time ago. It was a completely new South Africa, and I started to wonder how people in South Africa, white people, older people for the most part, would cope with the new South Africa, where financially they have a lot of power, but socially they don't. So I thought, okay, what would an ordinary bloke in his 50s, how would he feel? And he a policeman, how would he cope with the new South Africa? And then something I came to realize, that the thing about South Africa is that crime there's a lot of it. And also, a lot of it is sensational, so sensational that if I were to tell you some of the things, you'd say, oh, no, you couldn't possibly make that up. So I had that, and then I have lived in Sydney for a long time and love it very much. And I like writing about cities. I'm not a regional writer. So I hadn't been back to Cape Town for some years. So with this book, with Shadow City, I wanted to write about Sydney, but I wanted Skulk Lawrence, the Cape Town guy, in it. So I decided to combine the two. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you very much. Ellen, I wanted just to come to you on this, which is just the importance of place, particularly in crime fiction. I think you and I might have referenced, other wonderful works of literary fiction, which, as Michael said, you're inside someone's head. It almost doesn't matter where you are, but it matters very much in crime fiction. Can you talk a bit about that? And also about the abject fear of deciding to write about Tasmania?
Yeah, I mean, my first book, Prize Cat, no, not Prize Cat, Prime Cut, was set in Hopeton, which is where I was living at that time. That's on the south coast of WA. And then I moved back to Fremantle and set everything there. And then I moved to New Zealand. So it's like I can only imagine what I can see out of my window, really. So that's what I write about. And so now moving to Tasmania, I've been toying with the idea of setting something in Tasmania, which is obviously has got an amazing environment and landscape. You've got rugged mountains, you've got islands, you've got water, you've got all of that. But it's also you've got an amazing history in Tasmania, which very bloody and long, and it comes into a lot of our thinking now. I think it's still redolent in Tasmanian life, and so there's a lot to play with there. Yeah. But also, I think previously with my other books, my hero of main characters have been an outsider, so I've kind of given myself a bit of a license to be wrong, if you like. Whereas with the Tasmanian book, 2 out of the 3 main characters are insiders, the local Tasmanians, so there's more that I can get wrong in that case. And if I do get it wrong, I think people will let me know. That's why I've been so nervous about it. Yeah. But I think place has always been for me, both in what I write and what I read, a really important part of a story. It is a central character.
Michael, I want to come to Bella and Paul, the two they're sort of the two-handers in your series of books about the Blue Mountains. And I want to talk about how landscape has influenced those characters in particular, because they're both outsiders. How do they experience the Blue Mountains? How is moving there? Let's start with Paul. How has that changed him or not changed him?
It's the first thing that struck him was that it's very slow up there compared to Sydney. He's a fairly dynamic person in his 40s. And
in his first descriptions of him, he's always wearing like a Hugo Boss suit.
That's right.
And no one in the mountains is walking around in a Hugo Boss suit. He's really fish out of water.
That's right. And he's a single man looking for love, and he finds Katoomba is lacking in opportunity in many ways for him at first. But obviously that changes later on. So I've got him in later books taking up rock climbing because I thought, what a fabulous idea for a TV series, we can show more of the landscape. But of course, the thing that struck me, originally I thought I'll have lots of crime in the national parks and everything and really take advantage of the wilderness. But of course, criminals are like most people, they like to stay close to civilization. And if you go through the history of the place, there's very little crime that has occurred away from a made road or a building. So that kind of limits me more than I thought. Bella, I really wanted to write a character who was an older person, because I'm sick of all the young people in crime books. And so she's a woman around 60 who got sacked from her job, well, not sacked, retrenched from her job at the Sydney Morning Herald, ripped off by her financial advisor. And she had to leave Sydney. She had to sell up her house. She hadn't paid off the mortgage yet. And she's single too. And she's moved up there and she's a local newspaper person. I think for her it's more a shock of being in a small community. She doesn't get out into the bush as much as Paul does, that's for sure. But I think she's, she likes the European ambience of it, all those flowers and the European trees and everything. So between them, and it's interesting, they're both outsiders, because I was an outsider. I moved up there, about 10 years ago, and they're still discovering the place. And I think that can be kind of helpful for me as a writer, because it means they can notice things that someone who was born there might not notice.
Nat, when we meet Skulk Lawrence, we first meet him in Cape Town, and he works with an amazing staff of people in the police department. And what's happened to the corruption that is still going on in South Africa, the kind of aftershocks, the long shadow of apartheid is still very much present for them. Can you tell us a little bit in particular about Skulk Lawrence and about how the past and the present past has shaped him in Cape Town, and how he sort of experiences that on the land there?
Okay, but first I want to say something to Alan. Like Alan, I was incredibly nervous once I'd written about Cape Town, because I thought, oh my God, people in South Africa are going to read this, and I've lived in Australia forever, and they'll think, I've got it wrong and I'm telling them how to suck eggs. But it didn't happen, so don't worry too much. So I don't remember all the question. However, Skulk, I was very lucky. I had a school friend who was a cop during and after apartheid. And he was, South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He featured in that. And more recently, he got accused wrongly of war crimes in the apartheid era by somebody he'd been bringing to justice. And I made this happen to Skulk at the start of the book. It's not such a spoiler. And like many people in South Africa, Skulk thinks, okay, I've had it with this country. I wonder if I could make my home anywhere else. And his daughter has moved to Sydney, so he comes to be with her. And through the book, I wanted to describe Sydney through the eyes of someone who's seeing it for the first time. And he looks at Sydney and sees it and thinks, okay, could I live here? Is this my home? And then the question of where is home comes in. I've missed half your question.
No, I guess I was interested in, he's somebody he's old enough to have seen some of what happened.
Yes.
He's seeing the ramifications of it. I'm wondering how place has shaped him, how that violence in that place has shaped him and how he looks at the world and how he solves crimes.
Yeah, well, during apartheid, the police and the army worked together and did some terrible things. And Skulk was part of that. So those are his demons in a way. But unlike a lot of other detectives, he's not an alcoholic, he's not a deadbeat, he's just a bloke. And sorry.
We're going to unpack that. There's a lot in that, I think, for us to unpack. Hashtag not all blokes.
Yeah. He's trying to do the best he can. However, I have to say that in South Africa now, I went back earlier this year because Present Tense was launched there, and it's going to be re-released in December here. It's 30 years since apartheid. And it's, for many people who have been born after apartheid, it's old news for them. They don't want to know about it. Although the shadow still looms over South Africa, it has to change. So as far as Skulk's concerned, he's still wrestling a bit with it, but it's getting further away. Does that help?
It does. Yeah. Alan, I wanted to, we've been talking a bit about Tasmania and the challenges of writing about a place when you've come to it. I love your admission that you need to write about a place by looking out your window at it or walking up the mountains. Or
if I stand on tippy toes, you can just see the salmon pens.
Oh, right, it's very literal. But I wanted to say as well that part of the stories in your book, in Alan's book, are set in Afghanistan because Sam, our main character, he has PTSD, he's a former SAS soldier, bad things went down. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about how being in that landscape kind of has continued to affect him and affect how he thinks of what's right and what's wrong.
Well, Sam is he's got a young family and he's living in a rental accommodation in the northern suburbs of Hobart, and he's pretty much priced out of the game by all of the boomer tree changers like me who moved to Hobart and send the property prices sky high. So he's pretty resentful, and he's kind of also got a bit of a chip on his shoulder about just the fact that he can't make a go of it after kind of giving for his country. So he gets this job at the salmon farm and thinks everything's kind of going to be okay, and he maybe has his eye on one of the new housing developments off the highway, which he maybe can actually buy into, and he thinks maybe this is it. But he doesn't ever really quite believe that he's going to be that lucky, that his past is going to catch up with him because he has got a past that he needs to answer for. And so Afghanistan, while he's tried to bury his time there, it keeps on rearing its head one way or another.
Well, something that, Nat, you just said before, we were talking about laws being social, by crimes being so social. They're about the breaking of social mores. They're about the breaking of the laws of a place. And I wanted to ask each of you to sort of help us think about how specific crimes are to the place in which they happen. And I was thinking about that in relation to Afghanistan, that there were things that happened out there because it was lawless, because everything had broken down, and not dissimilarly in Cape Town. But I wondered, Michael, we might start with you, about what happens in, nothing, we don't want to be too disparaging about the Blue Mountains, but there's some very dark stuff that's happening in the community in Katoomba. and whether some of that crime is specific to that place, to people thinking that no one's noticing or no one's going to tell on them. Can you talk a little bit about that connection between the specifics of a crime and where it happens? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm not sure to what extent I necessarily agree with it. So the crime that is uncovered is domestic violence. So Paul Rule, my detective, was an ace homicide detective in Sydney, and he gets essentially, as I said, exiled there, and then he does normal duty policing, and he uncounters or uncovers this huge, or discovers for himself this huge phenomenon of domestic violence, basically, and realises that it comprises a huge proportion of an average cop's work. And from having been in the homicide squad for 15 years, apart from a few deaths, he sort of hasn't been brought face to face with the fact that often if you're a policeman now or a policewoman anywhere in New South Wales, you go to work and a lot of your work is to do with domestic violence. And as some of you probably know, dealing with domestic violence can be very frustrating. It requires huge reserves of patience. You have to keep coming back to situations where people are not prepared to make complaints, and you just have to be there for them and keep coming back until finally maybe they do decide to make a complaint. And as a working police officer with lots of things to do, that can be very frustrating. So I'd say I haven't discovered many crimes that I'd say necessarily grow out of the landscape or out of my particular place. It was more about Paul's personal discovery of what everyday policing is these days, I think. Yeah.
And I think your book is also really powerful. It looks at not just the crime itself, and you're right, perhaps in your story, those crimes are everywhere, but the response to the crime is interesting. There is a kind of a community, we keep quiet about that, he's a good bloke, bad day kind of stuff. Please, Nat.
Can I just say, what I really liked about your book was that Katoomba is so beautiful and such a tourist place in the Blue Mountains, and what Paul finds out is what's happening underneath it, and he slowly it slowly reveals itself to him, or he discovers it. And that was really interesting, the difference between what's on the surface in a place and what happens underneath the place. And that's one thing I really sort of fastened on in your book.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'm glad you like that. I mean, I think many communities could be like that. There's been a terrible story in Falconbridge in the Lower Blue Mountains the last few days that you probably heard about the death of two children. But I really think this sort of thing sadly can happen anywhere.
I think that's right. Alan, can I ask for your thoughts on this? Because I said to Alan before that whether other books were there about serial killers or about domestic violence, the crime really in Alan's book, a lot of the crime is about a kind of corruption. It's this extraordinary intertangling of power and entitlement. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about, whether that's like there's a real match to a flame in a community like where it's set in Tasmania that allows more of that to happen.
I think like many places, not just in Australia but around the world, there's certainly a boys' club of entitlement there, a very tight-knit community. The 6 degrees of separation are kind of halved, and it's very. If you're in amongst it, and have that access to that. To that power and that money and that influence over the generations, it becomes a source of entitlement. And I echo that entitlement of the people who are, if you like, running Tasmania behind the scenes with the entitlement of a certain group of people out in the field in Afghanistan who thought they were untouchable. Two types of untouchability, if you like. But I also want to talk about we talk about the crimes overseas, but also the crimes in Tasmania. Flanagan's book, in great detail, factual detail, talks about some of the anti-salmon farm activists and the forms of harassment that were used against them. And quite common was the gutted wallaby on the doorstep, which Flanagan refers to as a kind of a typical Tassie greeting, basically. So reading that made me think there's something in this for a crime book. And so there's lots of gutted wallabies in this book, I'm afraid. So if you love wallabies, look away.
Skip those bits. Hearing you say that, though, makes me think about the history of a place that, that you said it, in passing, that's like a typical Tasmanian welcome, but it's a very violent image. And Nat, it was something you and I talked about before this session about, what a culture hides and what it displays, and what we learn about these communities through the crimes that are committed and the response to the crimes. Nat, could you talk about that in relation to your book?
Okay. I first want to say that we're talking about South Africa in terms of crime, because we're talking about crime novels, but it's also a very dynamic, exciting place. And Skulk comes to Sydney, and I wanted to think about what somebody in Sydney would see. And the first day he's in Sydney, he walks down and sits in front of I've forgotten the name of it, the fountain in Hyde Park near the art gallery. You know the one I'm talking about, the Archibald Fountain. And he looks around and he says, well, where's the history of this place? I can't see, well, where are the Aboriginal artifacts? Where did this place come from? In Cape Town, which really was settled by whites in the 1600s, the buildings are more historic. There's more of a sense of place. So as part of the research for this book, I read Delia Falconer's book on Sydney, and Louis Naura has also written a fantastic book, mostly about the cross. And it's hidden, it's there, but it's not in your face. And it was a bit about the difference between those two ideas of place. One's the stuff that you see, and one's the stuff that happens underneath all that.
Ellen, can I ask you about that in relation to Tasmania? We're talking about gutted wallabies, and there's quite a lot. There's a lot of sort of almost kind of casual violence in the book, and that's separate to people who fought in war, for whom that's become a kind of way of living. When we think about Tasmania, we do think about its history. We think about Port Arthur and Martin Bryant, and we think about what people know or are beginning to really know about how Aboriginal people were treated on that land. Do you think that place and landscape holds on to those memories and kind of infuses itself into the present day?
I think so. I mean, a couple hundred years ago, the whole of Tasmania became a kind of a hunting ground, and that would seep into the landscape, I think. And the same sadness that came out of that could also be found in Port Arthur. I found it really hard to go anywhere near Port Arthur. The whole state, I think, seems to have ghosts walking in it, and there's a lot of sadness there as well as the beauty. But I think that's what makes it. It's a very special place to live in, but always keeping in mind an awareness and respect for what has happened to make it what it is now, I think.
Michael, when you're writing about the Blue Mountains, are you also conscious of weaving in or kind of nodding to or alluding to the history of how Aboriginal people in those areas kind of lived and were treated?
It's certainly a subject that you want to look at, but the Blue Mountains are a bit atypical, actually, because the soil is so poor up there. There's not much grass at all, and the vegetation tends to be fairly wiry. So there aren't any rivers. So in terms of food supplies for Aboriginal people, actually weren't that much there. And the anthropologists now say we had the Darug people to the northeast, the Gundungurra down the southeast, and the Wiradjuri off to the far west. And they came up to the mountains, but they probably didn't spend an awful lot of time there. And the early settlers, the early explorers saw virtually no sign of Aboriginal people up there. So it was certainly their country, but they didn't spend a lot of time on that country. And also the country wasn't particularly desirable for Europeans because it didn't have those grasslands they were really keen to get to out at Bathurst and further west. So there's a guy called Stephen Gapp who's written some great books about the Sydney Wars and the Bathurst Wars, about the experience of Aboriginal people, but there don't seem, as far as we know, to have been any massacres, for example, or killings in the Blue Mountains themselves. So it's for odd reasons of geography, a sort of a bit out of that bigger story that applies to most other parts of Australia. So the biggest Aboriginal event really was in 1957. There was an area called the Gully where about 20 poor families lived in Katoomba, and many of them were Aboriginal, although some of them from that area, but more of them had come from other parts of New South Wales almost, and they were all dispossessed. They were just thrown out to create a speedway track, which was a horrible incident and is very big in the consciousness of Aboriginal people in the Blue Mountains today. And I'm glad to say the speedway track was a complete failure. The civic fathers used to watch all these people driving up the Great Western Highway to Bathurst for the races, and they thought, hey, we want some of that. Why don't we build a speedway track? But Katoomba is so foggy, they had to cancel so many races that in the end they gave up and shut it down. So, yeah.
Natalie, we've been talking about, historical landscape, and we've been talking before about social landscape as well as landscape. But you said to me before this session something really interesting about the relationship between language and landscape. And I wondered if you could reflect on something you said about language mirroring landscape. Do you remember?
No.
She said something brilliant. It's passed her by. Yeah.
But thinking about it, I'm not so sure if it mirrors landscape as much as in terms of what the place looks like, but in terms of what the social landscape is. So, you read some, let's think of Peter Temple, Truth is a fantastic book. And he's pared the language down to absolute minimum, but it sounds completely like Australian English. And there's a writer I'm really keen on called Adrian McKinty, who writes about Ireland in the Troubles. And he doesn't kind of write, with apostrophes and bits and pieces to make it look like the language, but the rhythm of how the people talk in his books are absolutely of the place of that landscape. So I guess when I wrote this, certainly in present tense, the first book, which was all in Cape Town, some of it is in Afrikaans. There's glossaries in the back of both those books. Not a lot, but just enough, I hope, to give the flavour of the language. And here, it was interesting because Skalk has got to learn some Australian words because there are things that we say, what we call a ute here is called a bucky in South Africa. We abbreviate things. There are all sorts of things that are peculiar to us and a part of our social landscape. I think that's what I was trying to say.
It's fascinating. I wanted to ask you each about something that we think about a lot in crime fiction, which is how closely you write about the crime itself. How much violence goes on the page. I wanted to start with you, Alan, in terms of what you think about when you read other works of crime fiction, what you've thought about when you're writing it for yourself. I mean, there are things that we learned that happened in Afghanistan that this group of army soldiers did when no one was watching, and there are repercussions that happen years later. There's a lot of, some terrible stuff happening in Tasmania. What are your thoughts on how close to that violence you want to take the reader when you're writing and when you're reading?
I tend to avoid having it right there on the page and in your face, so to speak. I know that when I've read books or seen TV series where it's been kind of exploitative and explicit and relentless, I kind of feel exploited myself, and I just turn away. So I don't want to do that to other people. So yes, there is terrible violence that happens, but you tend to maybe arrive there a moment after and see what has been done, rather than be watching it unfold second by second by second. Or in terms of the Afghanistan flashbacks, you don't linger on it too long. It's something that is momentarily shocking, but more in that person's head than anything else. And so yeah, I'm aiming not to torture people with it, or myself, in fact.
It's interesting as well in Alan's book because he gives us the responses of different people to that crime. Exactly like you said, it's about how it lasts in our memory is the impact of the crime. So for Sam, he's really shaped by it. But we meet later on these two fantastically awful characters called Foot Rot and Moose. And for them, it was just another day. you know, and Sam's never recovered. So you also show the, reminds me of the Hitchcock quote about there's no fear in the bang, only in the anticipation of the bang. That it's that resonance of the thing that stays with you.
Yeah. Yes. You've nailed it, basically. Yeah, I think just it's. I've tried in all of the things I've written, just not to have a blow-by-blow account. Really, I don't think that does any of us any favors. And you don't need that. And I think there's a lot to be gained storytelling-wise from the threat and the menace and the suspense. But if you lay it all out there, then you lose all of that.
And Michael, can I come to you? Because there are two different sort of sets of crime in your book. There's domestic violence, which, as you say, is rampant, but there's also child sexual assault and child sexual abuse. What were you thinking about how, and you know, you've got a background as a journalist and a publisher. What are your thoughts on this about how much detail is too much? You know, are there places you won't go? What are your thoughts on that in relation to these books as well?
Yeah, I think most crime novels published in Australia today are pretty violent, even if the violence is not always on the page. And I know I wrote some crime novels like that, 15 years ago, and maybe I changed or got old or something, but I've tried to write books where there's not an awful lot of crime, either on the page or even off it. I'm drawn these days, not exactly to cosy crime, but to those sorts of books by people like Anne Cleeves, Louise Penny, even Donna Leon, where I think the ratio of crime to place and life and so on is a bit different. There's less crime in those books. The crime is slightly less important, and there's more attention given to characters perhaps and to description rather than to the plot. So, I don't know, you might call it slow crime or something, without saying those books are, without interest. I think the interest lies in a different sort of variety of elements. So, I'm trying to keep the crime content down a little bit. And that's why I put one of my wife's paintings on the cover there of a cat, because I just wanted it to look different from other crime novels as a sort of, if you like, a declaration that I was trying to write something that was a little bit different, more about the place, I suppose, and the people.
Nat, can I come to you as well about, I don't think it's a spoiler because we start to work out early on that the crime at the centre of Nat's book, I mean, there's a lot going on, is human trafficking. How did you decide, it's also for a lot of people, unless they've, read an article, or I know friends legally who work in the field, but if you don't know a lot about it, you have to give some sense of what it entails. How did you decide to do that in a way, and what were your thoughts on how much sort of distressing content you were willing to weave through the book, considering it's a very big part of what's going on?
Okay, how much time do we have left? Because I feel very strongly about this.
We've got time. We're doing beautiful.
I've got two things, and can I just talk generally? I feel very strongly about that crime porn, violence porn. And I read a lot of crime fiction, and some of it's very violent, but it's bad when you find it. I love Val McDermid. She's one of my heroes. But in the Tony Hill series, there are a couple of books. I got to the third or the fourth book, someone else is nodding, and I don't want to go into detail, but I thought, no, I actually can't go on with this. So I think there's a fine line between what you have to describe, because it is crime fiction, and what one shouldn't. So that's the first thing. The second thing...
Spooky, because it was actually a TV episode of Wire in the Blood that I turned away from.
Really? Yeah. Yes. It's just her other books are so fabulous, and this is fantastic too in a way, but it's just crossed the boundary for me. The other thing about crime fiction is that crime fiction authors mostly have to glamorize the crime to a certain extent. And when I decided I wanted to write about slavery and human trafficking, two things. Firstly, I had to make it so that it wasn't kind of worthy and depressing. I didn't want people to think, oh my God, here's another book I should read for the good of my soul. I wanted it to be exciting, and I hope it is. And I did a lot of research. I did a short online course with UTS, and Jennifer Byrne, who's head of anti-slavery at UTS, helped me quite a lot. So it was a question of getting some of the reality in, but not making it somehow lifting it up so that it was entertaining as far as that could be. Does that make sense? So crime writers are always kind of walking this tightrope of why we write and what we write about, and how we should or shouldn't write about that, what's ethical.
No, thank you very much for that. Helen, I wondered as well, when you're thinking about, we've talked about place and character and how much violence is too much and how you keep people with you. I loved what Michael said about slow crime. And, it's such an interesting genre. It's constantly reinventing itself. There are all these amazing authors who are always pushing out the boundaries of it. It's just endlessly it is entertaining but fascinating as well in terms of what it shows us about ourselves and what story can be. But I wondered, Ellen, when you think about writing Prize Catch and your other books as well, are you consciously thinking, well, I like these kinds of crime books? Or are you just thinking, I'm just going to write a story and this is how it comes out? I'm just wondering how three crime writers kind of engage with all the genre things.
I think Prize Catch is my first kind of departure from my previous more police procedural type of stories. This one has this kind of action thriller element to it where they get chased into the mountains and there's all sorts of, really fun stuff to write about. So actually I enjoyed just jumping a little bit out of my normal police procedural head, if you like, and in terms of the research for it, when I send the characters up into the mountains being chased by the bad guys, basically I had to go up into the mountains myself to kind of get it right, because if you claim that you can see something from a certain mountain and you can't, they'll come and find you. So
they might leave you a wallaby, I'm thinking.
Something like that, yeah. So I've done a few big treks in Tasmania. I've done the South Coast Track, which is a place in southwest Tasmania where you fly in and you walk out over 7 days, and it's pretty rugged. And it was, it's great to achieve it, but basically I hated most of those 7 days. And I channeled that feeling of kind of hate and hurt and pain and torment into what Sam goes through up in the mountains in this book. I remember one day on the South Coast Track, I was about waist deep in mud, and I was hitting the mud with my walking pole, shouting the F word over and over again. I was determined to teach that mud a lesson. So basically that's what kind of stuck with me when I was writing this book.
I love that. Michael, I wanted to ask you this question about, you mentioned before about the idea of slow crime, which I love. But are you conscious of playing with genre when you write? Are you conscious of reading other things and going, oh, I like a bit of that, I might head into that direction? What's your kind of relationship with the sort of the pillars of all the crime fiction that you read and that you write?
Yeah, I think it's almost not so much a matter of copying them as it sort of gives you authority or permission almost to write a different sort of crime novel. And so what I'm trying to do now is write crime novels that are a bit less like crime novels, that are more like I'm just a novelist writing a book and it happens to have a crime in it. So I can bring in other characters and pay a bit more attention to detail and everything. I know at the moment there's no higher accolade you can give a crime novel than that it's a page turner. And I don't think my books are, in the sense that I'm trying to put more effort into the writing so that, hopefully people might want to read the pages a bit more slowly. So that's my very strange ambition. I mean, it's an important part of being a writer, isn't it? You have to keep yourself interested, and often the things that you do to keep yourself interested are quite weird and probably not understandable to other people. But once you've written a few books, I think, you have to look for these little challenges. Although having said that, someone like Michael Connolly seems to be able to write the same book about 50 times, so it's not a problem that afflicts everyone. But I think that for me, that's a big thing about being a writer. You have to keep your imagination stimulated.
And not being, not trying to do like armchair psychology, but you talk about moving to the Blue Mountains and it being a slower pace, and now you're talking about writing in a way that is slower, that's spending more time on the page. I'm like wondering if landscape has shaped the way you're writing these books.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it has. I'm sure it has, and it's also a way for me to engage with that community, I suppose, and work my way into it and learn more about it and get a response from people in it. So, yeah, it's working for me at a number of levels.
Nat, you're a couple of books in, and I know that you're working on another one at the moment. do you think about, and you've mentioned some other fantastic crime writers, how do you think about how you want to shape your books in relation to them being part of a genre of crime fiction?
I don't really. I'm one of those, I want to tell a story. And it happened that Skulk was a cop, so that was a police procedural. And then when he came over to Australia, it still had to be a police procedural. But I read a lot of crime fiction. When I started to write, I thought, well, I started quite late, about 10 years ago, to write. And I thought, we'll pick a genre. And I thought, okay, crime fiction, I really love it. And I started thinking about the conventions. But when I write, I just sit down with an idea and go. I find it very hard to plan. And then it's a case of having read so much that you feel for the rhythm or the shape of what you're trying to write. So I don't think, okay, I'm going to write a page turner. I'm going to set it in, Paris, and it's going to be taken up. I don't. I just write the story that I want to write.
I like that very much. I want to come back to something you all mentioned in passing at the beginning of the session, which was about gender. We talked about toxic masculinity. We talked about, bad blokes in the police force. We talked about, I think in Michael's book as well, there's not only is there domestic violence, but we see the responses to the domestic violence. And it's kind of either, women's complaints are either minimised or they're not believed or... Yeah, as you said, you described it beautifully, which is also that for the people who have to go into those households, it's a lot of patience and frustration because they're going back in and seeing people in more and more pain who are more and more at risk. But I wanted to ask you all about gender in these stories. And I was in particular really struck by Alan's novel where you've got, this thread of male entitlement all the way through the book. And it's never didactic. I didn't feel like it was a man trying to do right. But it's a very big strand of... It's almost like hand in glove with the corruption. Can you talk about why you wove that in? It's almost in every story strand and sub-story strand in Prize Catch.
I think at the time of writing it, there was all of that stuff. The Brittany Higgins thing blew up, and it just seemed that every story on the news was something about that, and every news story came with a kind of a trigger warning, and so it was quite relentless, and it really echoed. I think it echoed. I think what was going on in terms of the government and politics and society generally, the entitlement and the baying men and the sense that they're untouchable. And it was difficult to ignore, I think. And so, again, it was all of the things to do with untouchability, be it guys running wild in Afghanistan, people stuffing up the environment in Tasmania, or people doing what they like in Canberra. It was all part of the same maelstrom, if you like. Maelstrom. Oh.
Wonder where that word comes from. That's right, exactly.
I might use that one later.
Yeah. Michael, I wanted to come to you, and there are a lot of characters, there are a lot of nuanced characters in your book. They're not all having this response, but there are people inside the police force, including women, who are sort of minimising it. Oh, that can't be domestic violence. I'm sure she's just confused or she's depressed because the kids have left her the home or whatever. I wanted to know how you brought that to life on the page, or how you consciously thought about that interplay between what we expect of men and women, what we expect between them, and what we normalise.
One of the issues in the book is that the perpetrator in the book was a policeman. He was the predecessor of my main detective. So he's been covered up or ignored by some of his colleagues in the preceding decade or so. So my interloping detective has to overcome that as well as find out the facts of what happened. And my hero himself, Paul, is torn because he's got certain vigilante tendencies and he'd just like to go in and sort it all out because he thinks maybe that's the only way to do it. And he has to sort of calm down a bit maybe and work with the system, which for him is quite a challenge. As I said earlier, he's sort of coming down from homicide where, when you think about it, a lot of homicide investigations are pretty black and white. you know, at least morally, and a lot of the facts are known. You usually know that someone's been killed, for example. Whereby in domestic violence, there's an awful lot of areas of grey, and that assists with cover-ups and protection and that sort of thing. So he's got to wade through all of that. And I think one of the questions at the end of the book is, did he give way to his vigilante tendencies or not? And I don't actually give a definite answer on that. But I think he comes out of the book potentially morally compromised. In other words, my main character may not be such a pleasant person after all, or may not be such a moral person after all. And I thought that was interesting, because one of the things about crime fiction is that usually our main character is morally superior to so many of the other people they meet. And I thought it might be interesting to try something different. And what if you have a main character who's flawed, not just because he's an alcoholic, as Natalie was saying before, or, you know, he's got problems with relationships. What about if you had a main character whose relationship with his own job might give rise to certain questions? So that's one of the ingredients I've got in there in terms of, you know, toxic masculinity or whatever.
I think something that's really satisfying in your book is that there are moments where we want Paul to race into a house. We want him to do vigilante stuff, and he does, and then he makes a terrible mess of it. He's wrong, or he doesn't get what he wants, or it doesn't help the crime. It's really, you let us sit with all the kind of complexity of that in a way that's enormously satisfying. Nat, in your book, there are lots of different ways that women and girls are mistreated, but there's also this really interesting other branch of it, which is that for Skulk Lawrence in his office, you know, all the women, all the people who run his department, the most talented people, the smartest people, are all women in the Cape Town Police Office. And it's a bit different in Sydney. You do see this kind of big gender imbalance. How conscious were you of wanting to show women in all these different positions of power and being very powerless?
I was quite conscious of it. Part of the research for Shadow City was talking to homicide detectives and retired homicide detectives, and I got to spend a lot of time with Deb Wallace, who some of you might have heard of, who's a very impressive woman who rose very high in the force. I spoke to Virginia Gorman, who's a homicide detective. Look, I spoke to a lot of women, and the thing I got from them were they were tough and they were funny and they were interesting, and they all said to me, I don't know how true this is, but they all said the time of, you know, women having to battle the men in the office is just about gone. So I didn't want to do that. In the first book, in present tense, Skulk has to learn about strong women, and his boss, Sisi Zangwa, is strong, and he has strong women colleagues. And then in Shadow City, we meet Jackie Rose, and Jackie's in her 40s. She's an Australian homicide detective, and she's what I love about Australian women. She's strong, she's tough, she calls a spade, and she's dogged. And it was less about toxic masculinity than powerful femininity that I was not femininity, feminism that I was interested in.
It's lovely. We're almost at the end, but I wanted to ask you each just one quick writerly question, which is, what do you do when you get stuck? You know, these three amazing authors have described these fabulous stories and characters, but maybe sometimes it takes a while for them to come together. Alan, what do you do when it's just you hit a kind of a wall, or do you hit a wall?
Yes, I do. I could say I just kind of drink and do deadbeat stuff, but no.
You go on long walks and swear at nature, maybe?
Yeah, that is usually quite inspiring, getting out there into the wilderness and just kind of emptying my mind of everything apart from getting from A to B. And that's kind of a metaphor for the writing. You need to get from A to B and then all the way through to Z. I kind of, at the moment, my big thing is to get out there and walk in those mountains or swim in that cold water and just try and empty my mind of things and clear it out.
Michael, you spoke a moment ago about wanting the page to be interesting to you. You know, you're a number of books in now, you've been writing for a long time, you're deepening the practice. I suppose, how is your writing process changing, and what do you do when things aren't quite going the way you thought they would?
Yeah, that happens often. I just keep writing. That's my secret, and I write an awful lot of stuff that on rereading turns out to be no good. But in the process of doing that, and it's a very laborious process, it helps me understand what's no good. The other thing I'd recommend is going to sleep. Often if you, at the end of the day, if I go to sleep with a problem in my mind, it's amazing how often the next morning things seem a little clearer. I don't know if my subconscious has been working away, but a number of writers have told me the same thing. So, yeah, just keep going.
Nat, what about for you?
What they both said, except I don't drink, I eat. So anything with sugar in it. And I am the Olympic level procrastinator in any case. But you do need to park the bum on the chair and keep writing. Like you, I swim, I exercise, I shower. Showering's good too, sleeping's good. Doing something that isn't about writing, and then you have to get back to it. It's not going to write itself. You just have to do the job.
I heard an interview recently with Aaron Sorkin where he talked about when he's stuck, he has a shower, and there are days when he has 10 showers. And he comes out and he's solved a scene or he's solved a character. I thought that was wonderful. Very quickly before we wrap, today, Michael, when you go out there, you will be signing copies of your books, but I think this is the first time that they're going to be, on a table in Sydney. Why did you decide to only stock them in local stores in the Blue Mountains?
I only started them because a friend who ran a bookshop up there said, wouldn't it be great to have some local books, because I'd stopped writing crime fiction some time ago. So I did one just for fun. And I got so interested in this local aspect of the whole thing. It's like wine, it's of the region, that I decided that I'd publish it myself, because I used to be a publisher, but would only be sold in the bookshops up there. I did approach some commercial publishers, but of course they said it was crazy. Why would you publish a book and sell it in only 4 bookshops? But it's worked out okay, thanks to the huge flood of tourists. So that's what's happening.
Wonderful, very exciting. I was going to say Michael, Natalie and Alan are all going to be signing copies of their books at in front of the bookshop out in the foyer, which is lovely. You're very welcome to talk to them when they've finished their signing, or talk to them quickly while you're doing the signing. Tickets to other events, I should say, are for sale at the festival reception table, which is also opposite the library bookshop, and you can get fabulous tote bags and all your bad crime writing festival merchandise that you need to get. But I wanted to thank you all so much for being with us to be part of today's festival session. Enjoy the rest of the festival, but for now, please join me in thanking Alan Carter, Michael Duffy and Nat Conyer.
And thank you, Michaela.